Post-colonial Singapore. The history of Singapore is a very interesting one in that the majority of its recorded history has been under colonial occupation. But nonetheless, we will explore pre-colonial history as a Malay fishing village and a trading port, through to colonial history, where Sir Raffles founded a British trading port, to post-colonial history, where Singapore is now the trade capital of Southeast Asia. We will also look at how Singapore has become a third space society. Singapore is first recorded in the Chinese archives. They mention a place called Pu Luo Chung, which translates the Malay Pulau Ujung, literally meaning island at the end. The Sejarah Melayu, or the Malay Annals, record a tale of a prince of the Srivijaya kingdom from the island of Sumatra in Indonesia, who visited the island in the 13th century. It is said that he saw a lion and founded the city called Singapura, or Lion City in Sanskrit. A Chinese traveller, Wang Dayuan, referred to a place called Denmasi, or Malay Temasek, which contained both Chinese and Malay residents. In the 1370s, Singapura was caught in the middle of the war between Siam, Thailand, and the Majapahit Empire, based in Java, Indonesia. The last king of Singapura, Parameswara, or Sultan Iskandar Shah, was forced out and later formed the Sultanate of Malacca. In the 15th century, Singapore was a Thai vassal state until it was conquered by the Malacca Sultanate, which was founded by the exiled Singaporean king. Singapore also became an important trading port of the Malacca Sultanate. The Malaccan Sultanate ruled Singapore as a trade port for many years. However, in the year 1511, the Portuguese invaded. The Portuguese captured the city of Malacca and attempted to consolidate the trade. However, traders, fearing Western influence, fled to the other ports in the area. The exiled Sultan fled to the south and was eventually defeated in Bintang. His son eventually established a brand new sultanate known as the Sultanate of Johor. The Portuguese got more than they bargained for, as they defeated a strong ally of the Chinese. The Chinese emperor retaliated by attacking and disrupting Portuguese trade and imprisoning Portuguese envoys until the year 1557. The Portuguese believed that by capturing the city of Malacca in the year 1511, they would be able to gain control of such a valuable trade hub. But what they really did was scatter trade. Instead of it being a strong, regulated, controlled environment, trade was now split between all the different island ports in the area. Piracy went rampant without the policing of the Malaccan Navy. Several other trade ports sprung up and attracted the traders due to, firstly, them being Muslim, and secondly, them being locals as opposed to a foreign power. In the year 1587, the Portuguese destroyed all the settlements in the island of Singapore, and the island sank into obscurity. Between the 16th centuries and the 19th centuries, the Malay archipelago was gradually taken over by European powers. In the 17th century, the Sultanate of Johor and the Dutch Empire challenged the Portuguese by attacking and eventually capturing the city of Malacca. Of course, Malacca was no longer what it once was. It was a shell, it had hardly any wealth, but the Dutch took it over anyway. They now had a monopoly on trade in this area, and the British did not appreciate this because they consistently prohibited the British from operating in Dutch-controlled ports or subjected them to a very high tariff. In 1818, Sir Stamford Raffles was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Bencoolen. In an attempt to try and bypass these Dutch regulations, he convinced Lord Hastings, the Governor-General of India, to fund an operation to seek a brand new trade port. Sir Stamford Raffles landed in Singapore on the 28th of January 1819. He chose this island because of its deep natural harbour, its abundant freshwater supplies, and its adequate natural resources like timber for repairing ships. He discovered a small Malay village on the mouth of the Singapore River, whose population was about 1,000. As this island was under the control of the Sultan of Johor, Sir Raffles negotiated with him, and on the 6th of February 1819, modern Singapore was born. Raffles left William Farquhar as governor of Singapore, and decreed that Singapore was to be a free port. Traders seeking to avoid the Dutch trading restrictions flocked to Singapore, causing the city to grow and prosper. During its first year of operation, 400,000 Spanish dollars worth of trade passed through Singapore. By the year 1821, the island's population had grown to 5,000, and the trade volume had increased to 8 million Spanish dollars. The population reached the 10,000 mark in about 1825, along with a trade volume of 22 million Spanish dollars. By 1825, Singapore had passed the long-established port of Penang by having a far higher trade volume pass through it. As Singapore was under the governorship of Major William Farquhar, it had only a small regiment of Indian soldiers along with a little bit of artillery to defend it, and establishing a trade port from scratch was a very, very tough thing to do. Farquhar's administration was, reasonably funded, but was prohibited from collecting port duties to raise revenue, due to Singapore being a free port. Farquhar invited settlers to Singapore, as well as attracted trade ships by sending a British official to St. John's Island to invite passing ships to stop in Singapore. As news of the free port spread across the archipelago, traders from all over the world flocked to Singapore. Most of them were seeking to circumvent the Dutch trading restrictions. On the 7th of June 1823, John Crawford signed a second treaty with the Sultan of Johor, extending British possession over most of the island. The Sultan also ceded the administrative rights to the British, bringing Singapore effectively under British law. In the year 1824, Singapore was ceded in perpetuity to the East India Company by the Sultan. The British now owned the entire island. The Dutch protested, claiming that the British had violated their sphere of influence. However, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824 firmly consolidated Singapore as British. Singapore grew to prosperity, becoming a very important port in the region. This was because of many factors, some of which were the opening of the Chinese market, the advent of steamships, the production of rubber and tin, not only in Singapore but also in Malaya, and of course its status as a free port. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 brought even more European trade to Singapore, as well as Asian trade heading towards Europe. By the year 1880, over 1.5 million tons of goods were passing through Singapore each year, with around 80% of the cargo transported by steamships. Many merchant houses were set up in Singapore, not only by Europeans, but also by Chinese, Arab, Armenians, Jewish, Americans, and Indian merchants. Also, many Chinese middlemen chose to live in Singapore and handle trade between Europeans and Asians. The population by the year 1827 had become predominantly Chinese, with the ethnic Malays coming in second until the 1860s, when they were overtaken by Indian labourers and traders. Indian sepoy troops were also garrisoned in Singapore. Even though Singapore was such an important port, The British administration was unfortunately very ineffective. It was understaffed and apparently unconcerned with the welfare of the population. Most of the population did not have access to healthcare, allowing diseases such as cholera and smallpox to flourish, especially because Singapore contained a lot of overcrowded working class areas. As Singapore was a trade port, the majority of the population was male and uneducated, and as a result, society grew lawless. Secret societies were popular, mainly the Chinese ones, and police were unable to control the city. In the year 1850, there were only 12 police officers in a city of nearly 60,000 people. Due to Singapore's continuous growth and the ineffective leadership or governance of the East India Trading Company, the British government set up a separate crown colony on the 1st of April 1867. This colonial government attempted to fix the social problems facing Singapore, including trying to solve the housing shortage and fix the poor health and living standards. In the year 1889, the governor attempted to ban secret societies, but this only forced them underground. In the year 1906, a revolutionary Chinese organization dedicated to the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, the ruling dynasty of China, set up a branch in Singapore, which served as the organization's headquarters in Southeast Asia. The members of this branch attempted to fundraise for this revolution, and one of them, Chan Po Yin, raised over 30,000 yuan for the purchase and shipment from Singapore to China of military equipment and for the support of the expenses of people traveling from Singapore to China for revolutionary work. As Singapore had a large Chinese population, they donated generously towards this revolution. And in the year 1911, it established the Republic of China. World War I did not really affect Singapore, as the war did not make its way this far south. However, a small skirmish did occur with the Sepoy Mutiny of 1915. Now, this mutiny wasn't really a big deal. However, as the Ottoman Emperor was viewed as the head of the Muslim world, this particular division was completely Muslim, and at the thought of them being sent to fight the Ottoman Empire, they revolted. Now, this battalion didn't really get that far. They revolted. Their revolt was quickly put down. They did, however, kill their officers and several British civilians before troops arriving from Johor in Burma ended up suppressing this unrest. After the First World War, the British government constructed a massive naval base in Singapore. At that time, this contained the world's largest dry dock. It also contained the third largest floating dock, and enough fuel tanks, and I quote, enough fuel to support the entire British Navy for 6 months. It was heavily defended by 15-inch naval guns, as well as having RAF squadrons, Royal Air Force squadrons, that were stationed at Tengah Air Base. Winston Churchill is quoted as to have called it the Gibraltar of the East. Unfortunately for the British, it was a base without a fleet. The British home fleet was stationed in Europe, and the plan was for it to sail quickly to Singapore when needed. Unfortunately, after World War II broke out, the fleet was fully occupied with defending Britain. During World War II, the British military commanders in Singapore believed the Japanese would attack. However, they thought the Japanese would attack from the south. This was because the dense Malay jungles provided a natural barrier. A squadron of British warships was sent to Singapore to aid in its defense. However, as their aircraft carrier ran aground, the squadron had no air cover. It did, however, have two capital ships, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the cruiser HMS Repulse. These two battleships were unfortunately sunk by the Japanese, resulting in the worst naval defeat in British history. This also proved to the Allies how important air cover was, resulting in the United States and the United Kingdom investing in aircraft carriers over battleships. In the year 1942, the Japanese invaded and conquered Singapore. This resulted in the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. The British had lost all credibility as the infallible leader of Singapore in the eyes of the locals. This, along with the brutality of the Japanese when they occupied the city, led the Singaporeans to campaign for self-rule. The British allowed Singapore to form a first legislative council in the year 1948. This was a very limited form of self-rule, as only 6 of the 25 seats on the council were elected, and only British subjects held the right to vote. In the year 1951, the second Legislative Council was formed. However, this time the number of seats that were elected was 9 instead of 6. In the year 1955, Singapore was granted partial internal self-government. David Marshall was the first Chief Minister of Singapore. In the year 1959, Singapore was granted full internal self-governance. In the first election, held in May 1959, the People's Action Party, or the PAP, won the polls in a landslide victory, winning 43 of the 51 seats. They wanted to merge with Malaysia in order to form the Federation of Malaysia. And on the 16th of September 1963, Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo and Sarawak were merged, and Malaysia was formed. The union was rocky from the start, of course due to cultural differences with Malaysia and Singapore, and 2 years later Singapore was kicked out of the Federation, and on the 9th of August 1965, the government of Singapore declared independence from England and Great Britain. The Republic of Singapore was created in December that year, with Yusof bin Ishak as the first president. The Housing Development Board was created and tasked with housing the population of Singapore. This was an attempt to try and combat the homelessness that led to crime in Singapore. The new nation of Singapore was faced with threats almost immediately from both the Malaysian Federation and the Indonesian military. There was also the internal social unrest they had to deal with. Unemployment was high, leading to social problems like crime and poor healthcare. The Economic Development Board was established in 1961, before they were granted independence, to grow Singapore's economy. The service industry grew alongside the industrial estates, increasing commerce, especially through visiting ships in the port. In an attempt to provide housing for the masses, the Housing Development Board built apartments, sort of like tenements. And the Central Provident Fund Housing Scheme, introduced in the year 1968, attempted to increase home ownership in Singapore by allowing residents to use their compulsory savings accounts to purchase flats built by the Housing Development Board. In the year 1967, with secret help from Israeli advisors, the Singaporean Armed Forces was established. This was due to Britain announcing that they would pull out their military forces between 1965 and 1971. Changi International Airport was opened in 1981, creating a massive increase in the demand for the service, for workers in the service industry. This has assisted in growing Singapore's reputation as a service-oriented country. The Mass Rapid Transport System, or the Internal Train System, MRTs, were created in 1987, connecting most of the housing estates with the city centre. The housing estates were built in small suburbs outside the main city centre. Today, Singapore is nicknamed the trade capital of Southeast Asia. It is a global commerce, financial, and transport hub. It has also been awarded many standings, including the second most competitive country in the world, and it's also known as one of the top 2 busiest container ports since the year 1990. Singapore is ethnically diverse, with the majority of its population, 76.2%, being of Chinese descent. The ethnic Malay population is around 15%, and the Indian population 7.4%. They are both strong minorities, however they are not discriminated against or favoured by the government. Before the British arrived, Singapore's religion was that of the local Malay kings, which was Islam, along with some of the traditional beliefs of the people there. The British brought Christianity with them. Their Indian soldiers brought Hinduism and Jainism with them, and the Chinese merchants brought Buddhism and Taoism. As a result, Singapore is not only ethnically diverse, but also religiously diverse. This has created a very multicultural society. The way that the government of Singapore has addressed this issue is to declare Singapore as a secular state. Due to the religiousness of the population, all the beliefs are respected, and all holidays, especially religious holidays, are recognized by the state. This includes the holidays of Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. None of these religions, however, affect government policy. Singapore had existed under the rule of the Malay kings for centuries. The culture was Malay, the language was Malay, the religion was Islam, and before that the traditional faiths. The British brought Indians and Europeans to Singapore, and brought with them the culture of colonial Singapore. Chinese merchants and traders also came to Singapore and established trade offices there. The Singapore that existed before the British colonized it is no longer the same Singapore that exists today. It is ethnically different, multiculturally different, and religiously different. When Singapore gained independence, it's no longer the ethnic culture or the colonial culture. What came out of it was something very different. With so many different cultures cohabitating such a small island, a third space culture had to have been created. It was not that which existed before, or that which was brought with the British. It was a combination of all of the above, along with some new stuff tossed in the mix. This all combined together to create the culture that now exists in Singapore.